الخلائق أجمعين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is a little bit of a new experience not to be able to see the audience. So I can't quite see if I'm able to be heard and who I'm speaking to. But inshallah, we will try to make the best of these changed circumstances. Originally, I was hoping to visit Houston for a few days in the month of Ramadan, and of course, circumstances don't allow for that. But over the next few nights, we will talk a little bit about the teachings of Quran and Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam with regard to our moral development and our character building. And I will be speaking in light of the ahadith that are quoted in this book, Wasa'il al-Shi'a, which many of you may have heard of. Wasa'il al-Shi'a is an encyclopedia of ahadith of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam that is primarily concerned with ahadith of fiqh, of Islamic law. But one part of Islamic law is ethics. And that, in fact, is what distinguishes Islamic law from secular law. Secular law is designed to order society. It is concerned with the outward aspect of your behavior, whereas Islamic law does have the purpose of organizing society, but it also has the greater purpose of organizing our inward life, the life of our soul and our spirit. And that is why Islamic law is concerned with our niyyah and our intention, whereas secular law is not concerned with our intention. If you stop at a red light, it doesn't matter if you stop at a red light because you are concerned about safety, or if you are stopping at a red light qurbatan ilallah, or if you are stopping at a red light because you are afraid of getting caught by the police and paying a ticket. Maybe you're stopping at the red light because you are stingy and you don't want to pay money to for the penalty of speeding. Whether your niyyah is fear of a penalty, whether your niyyah is qurbatan ilallah, whether your niyyah is for a human reason to provide safety to people, in the eyes of the law, it is all the same. But in Islam, the niyyah is important. And in fact, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ, hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, narrated by Sunni and by Shia, that in Islam, the primary concern is not what you do in the external world, but rather it is what your intention is and the reason you do that action. The source of the action is more important than the outward effect. This is also the answer to a common question that people have. Why is it that Islamic law sometimes doesn't seem to fit our circumstances? People have this question about so many different areas of Islamic law. For example, the Islamic rules of hijab. At one time, hijab was part of people's natural practice of modesty. Today, sometimes it's a little bit awkward to wear hijab, to say that I'm sorry, I don't shake hands with a non-mahram woman or with a non-mahram man. And even Muslims in their own family or in their own community, they feel like haya is one thing, modesty is one thing, but hijab is something else. Haya is understandable, but hijab is a little bit hard to explain or justify to people. Or salat. At one time when people woke up with fajr and they went and they worked on their farms, and then they came home and by maghrib time they would go to sleep, it made sense to pray salat and to pray salatul layl, namaz shab, and the rhythm of people's lives made it easy to pray. But today, if you have to work and you have an early morning commute and you have to drive, to your school or your job in the city and come back to the suburbs, then you might be awake late. You might not be able to wake up at Fajr and then stay awake for work. So many people, they find it difficult to practice the laws of prayer or hijab or so many other laws of Islam. They are thinking of the purpose of fiqh as being similar to the purpose of secular law. And so they might say that these laws of Islam that we have, the hudud, punishments for theft or for adultery, the laws of ibadah like salat, the laws of social intercourse like hijab and other rules of social relationships, these are awkward. But the answer to that question is that in Islam, our purpose is not just to facilitate a smooth operation in society. Our purpose is to facilitate the purification of the soul. And sometimes the needs of the soul are such that we are not just making a law that fits with the present needs of society, but rather a law that connects us to our religious role models, to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wa alihi, to Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam. Let me give another example. Many ahadith tell us and the Quran tells us that we are to give zakat in order to eradicate poverty. But zakat in traditional Islamic law is only on 9 goods. There are 4 types of grain. There are 3 types of livestock, animals, and 2 types of currency. There is no zakat on rice. There is no zakat on many of the fruits and vegetables that we consume. For example, on lentils. There is no zakat on modern money because modern money is not gold and it is not silver. And so people ask that question, that if zakat is meant to eliminate poverty, how is it going to eliminate poverty when these 9 things that were in the time of the Prophet, they have zakat, but other forms of wealth do not have zakat? Maybe at that time, those were the main forms of food and the main forms of wealth people had, and therefore zakat was effective. But today it is not effective. So that same question arises with zakat that we mentioned for hijab or for prayer, namaz, or that we mentioned for other acts of worship. But when we say that zakat is for 9 things, the reason for that is that this is a sunnah. It is a law that is set by the Prophet. Maybe it doesn't solve the need of poverty today because the causes of poverty are different today. The forms of human wealth are different today. And the traditional understanding or laws of zakat are not sufficient. But when we say this was a sunnah of the Prophet, and we are going to practice it as part of our religion in order to keep alive the sunnah of the Prophet, that connection to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wa alihi, that connection to Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam, that preserves for us a religious community, that preserves for us a continuity of our religious life, that facilitates our spiritual path. So if you think of it as a secular law, maybe it seems like it's not effective. But if you think of it as something that is designed to help you become a better person, to travel an inner path of enlightenment, according to the teachings of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wa alihi and Ahlul Bayt, then it makes sense. Then that teaching of zakat, which doesn't fit the pattern of our modern life, that hijab, which doesn't fit the patterns of our modern life, that salat, namaz, which doesn't fit the patterns of our modern life, it keeps us connected to those people, the ma'sumin alayhimus salatu wassalam, who are our role models for our inner life. And then, of course, we do have to figure out how do we make up that difference. If zakat is not meeting the needs of poverty as a society, we need to come together, whether a community of mu'mineen, of believers, or a society with a government, and come up with policies and practices that can eliminate poverty. But that doesn't mean zakat is not important. Zakat is still fulfilling a role in keeping our connection to our religious leaders, in facilitating a spiritual life. So the point I want to make is the basic difference between Islamic law and secular law is that secular law's primary and only concern is the structuring of social relationships. If there is order in society, nazm in society, then the purposes of secular law have been fulfilled. But Islamic law does want to preserve nazm in society, order in society. And it has a higher purpose, which is for your self, your nafs, your ruh to become pure. And sometimes the focus on the purification of the nafs means that that social aspect is not the only consideration. There are other considerations. I mentioned the hadith of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wa alihi, innamal a'malu binniyat. Let me explain the proper understanding of that hadith before we move on. Some people misuse this hadith, or they misunderstand this hadith to mean that it doesn't matter what you do as long as your niyyat is good. So they say that, for example, if I don't pray, but I have a good heart, innamal a'malu binniyat. Or if I do wudu, but I don't do wudu properly, and I miss some of the wajib parts of wudu. Some people say, God is not concerned about my details. It doesn't make a difference to Allah whether I do wudu like this or like that. Innamal a'malu binniyat. My intention is good. I wanted to do wudu. I wanted to pray. Now, if I missed my tashahud or if I mispronounced my surah, don't make a big deal. That's a common misunderstanding of the hadith, innamal a'malu binniyat. That's not what it means. What the hadith means, Allahu a'lam, is that if you do a good deed, meaning if you do it properly, the value of that good deed is based on your intention. So if I do a good deed, let's say that there is a poor person and I give some financial assistance to that poor person. That is a good deed. The poor person now has a meal that they didn't have before. From the perspective of secular society, that's a good deed because it has provided a benefit to a person. In the example of the traffic light, you stopped at the traffic light, you stopped an accident from taking place. Your good deed has done. You have obeyed the law. But from the perspective of Islam, if a deed is good, then its value is based on the intention. If your intention was to impress somebody, then it is a worldly deed, has no spiritual value. It's helped a person, but it hasn't helped your soul. If you do it for the sake of humanity and sympathy and kindness, then that is better because this is part of your fitrah. This is why Allah says that He loves people who are generous, sakhi, and kareem, even if they are not mu'min, or even if they commit many sins. Why? Because sakha and karam and jood, generosity, are attributes of Allah, and they are attributes that Allah loves. So this is better But if I'm not doing it qurbatan ila Allah, it's still not the best level of sincerity. Then if I do that same good deed, and I do it not just to impress somebody, not even just for the sake of my human desire to be generous and to be kind, but I do it seeking the pleasure of Allah. إِنَّمَا نُطْعِمُكُمْ لِوَجْهِ اللَّهِ. We only do it for Allah. لَا نُرِيدُ مِنْكُمْ جَزَاءً وَلَا شُكُورًا. We're not looking for you to give us a reward. We're not even looking for you to say thank you. That is the highest level. إِنَّمَا نُطْعِمُكُمْ لِوَجْهِ اللَّهِ. We're doing it just for the sake of Allah. So this is what the hadith means, that you have a low action which is just maddi, then you go one level up, and it is a fitri good action, but not fully developed. Then you go one level up, and it is an ibadi action. It is for the sake of Allah. إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ does not mean a bad action can become good. An improper wudu, an improper salat, an improper hajj can become valid because your heart was okay. No. إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ means that if you do the right thing, now the value of that right thing, that depends on the purity of your intention, the khulus and the ikhlas, the purity and the sincerity of your niyyah. So the proper understanding of that hadith is to encourage us to do what is right, to do our ibadah properly, do your wudu carefully, do your salat carefully, do your hajj properly, follow all of the proper details of the law. But then when you do it properly, don't say that, well, I've done a good deed and a good deed is a good deed. No, the more pure my intention becomes, the more that good deed rises to achieve the pleasure of Allah. I know people when they fast, or I used to know people when they would fast, they would say, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. Don't worry about Fajr time and Imsak time. Just stop eating. You know, if Fajr time is at 4:45, stop eating at 4:45 or 4:50 or 4:55. Doesn't make a difference. إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. No. What Allah wants is, if this is the proper time, then stop eating at that time. Do your ibadah properly. And now that you're doing it properly, the good deed of an ignorant person, the good deed of a careless person, the good deed of a hypocritical person, and the good deed of a mu'min and a muttaqi and a muhsin are not the same. Even if the outward good deed is the same, every one of them gives $10 to somebody who is in need of money for lunch. But each of them has done the same action. Their niyat are different, and therefore their amal in the eyes of Allah, عند Allah, is a different amal. The world will see it as one, but Allah will see it as completely different, because for Allah it is the niyyah and not the outward amal that is of essential importance. So what we have talked about so far is the difference between Islamic law and secular law. And one of the reasons why Islamic law will not fulfill the same purposes that secular law will. Some people have that confusion about fiqh, or that frustration with fiqh. They think that the job of zakat is poverty reduction. One of the purposes of zakat was poverty reduction. But the purpose of zakat is what zakat means. قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ تَزَكَّى. The meaning of zakat is self-purification. قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ تَزَكَّى, one who purifies himself. And ahadith say this means by giving zakat. Because when I give willingly in the way of Allah, it's the most difficult thing for many of us to do. that I earned money and then somebody comes to me and says, have you paid zakat? Have you paid khums? And I say, I have a mortgage. I have student loans. I have a car payment. I have not gone on vacation for so many years because I've been saving up for a down payment. And you want me to pay zakat? You want me to pay khums? It's a difficult thing. قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ تَزَكَّى. A person who gives zakat, other meaning, a person who purifies himself, is successful. So the goal of our ibadat is to purify the self. That is the value of our actions. The effect of zakat is that when I give the zakat, I feed somebody who needed food, I give support to somebody so they can pay their debts, I support a religious project so a masjid can be successful in meeting its expenses. That is the effect. But the primary goal is tazakka, inside myself. It is internal. The same thing applies to all of our other acts of worship. And this is why إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ, that our actions are based on not the outward aspect, but on the inner aspect. Let me explain that in a little bit more detail. Inshallah, tomorrow I will talk about our main topic, which is jihadun nafs, according to the teachings that we find from Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam, but I have about 5 minutes. So let me introduce two concepts that are discussed by ulama of akhlaq, scholars of akhlaq. There are two kinds of goodness in a good deed. One is known as husn fa'ili, and one is known as husn fi'li. Husn fa'ili is the goodness of the intention that a person has. And husn fi'li is the goodness of the action itself. Sometimes the two come together. Like I have a sincere intention and I do a good deed. I do prayer, which is good action, for the sake of Allah, which is a good intention. So here we have husn fi'li, because namaz is a good deed. And we have husn fa'ili, because my intention is good. Sometimes I have husn fa'ili, but not husn fi'li. Like for example, if I do an ibadat that I think is an ibadah, but it is not actually desired by Allah. Let's say I fast on Eid al-Fitr. Eid al-Fitr is a day when fasting is not allowed. So this is not desired by Allah. So there is no husn fi'li. This is not a good deed. Allah has not asked for it. Allah does not want it. But I didn't know. My intention was to fast qurbatan ilallah. So we have husn fa'ili, but not husn fi'li. Other times, we have husn fi'li, but not husn fa'ili. Like for example, I fast in the month of Ramadan, which is husn fi'li, it's a good deed. But I do it to impress you and not for Allah. Or I give charity for a good cause, that's a husn fi'li, it's a good deed. But I give that charity not for the sake of Allah, I give the charity just to get a tax deduction or just to show off that I have sponsored this iftar so people can praise me. There is husn fi'li, it's a good deed, but not husn fa'ili, which is the intention. The basis of our salvation is husn fa'ili, the sincerity and the intention. The Quran says, وَأَنْ لَيْسَ لِلْإِنسَانِ إِلَّا مَا سَعَى. No human being will have but what they intended. So the basis of our salvation is husn fa'ili, not husn fi'li. This is something that I will talk about in a little bit more detail in a minute. However, husn fi'li is important because every action has certain effects. And so we have an obligation to try to know what is it that Allah wants, so that we can accomplish those purposes that Allah wants us to accomplish. Sometimes people have good intentions. They want to help Islam. But let's say I see a lady not wearing hijab, for example, and maybe she's not a bad person. I come to her and I say, why don't you fix your hijab? And I have husn fa'ili, meaning I say that because I want to honor hijab and I want to honor the teachings of modesty. But what happens? I cause her offense. Maybe I cause her embarrassment. Maybe she comes and says, these religious people are always arrogant and always judging other people. And she's justified in being angry and offended. So my husn fa'ili has caused harm in society. The basis of our salvation is husn fa'ili. But husn fi'li is important because the effects of our actions will have consequences for us and others. And so husn fa'ili demands that we make every effort to learn what is our obligation, to use our aql and our hikmat, to act with wisdom, so that we bring about those goals that Allah wants believers to accomplish. When I am a believer, the effect of my iman in society should not be that people say these so-called ulama or these so-called mu'mineen are arrogant or are self-serving or are hypocritical. I should make iman something that is well-liked and respected in society so that people can benefit from those teachings, so that I can benefit from those teachings. So although what's truly important is husn fa'ili, in order to have husn fa'ili, you have to learn what is the right course of action. What is husn fi'li? And the opposite of husn is qubh. Qubh fa'ili, a bad intention. Qubh fi'li, a bad action. You need to know that in order to apply it with sincerity. Some people ask that question, that what about the athar wad'iyya of a bad deed? Athar waz'i. That if I accidentally drink alcohol, I don't know it's alcohol. If I accidentally eat pork, I don't know it's pork. Is it going to cause me harm? Allama Tabatabai says that there are no athar wad'iyya for your soul other than what is based on ita'ah and ma'siyat of Allah. If you obey Allah, then whatever athar there are of your actions, they will be positive. And if you disobey Allah, whatever athar there are of your actions, they will be negative. So it is husn fa'ili and qubh fa'ili that is going to determine your salvation. Don't worry about what if this is something bad for me that I don't know about. That is not your concern or my concern. Allah will not allow us to suffer harm if our intention is pure. You and I need to purify our intention. In purifying our intention, we do have to know what is husn fi'li and qubh fi'li, what is a good deed and what is a bad